reason we gave the title, Why We Fight, How Young Americans in New York City Are Fighting the Culture Wars. We're very, very much looking forward to hearing your side of the story. And since it's a success story, as I'm led to believe, you have quadrupled, you have doubled in size?
Even more, man.
Okay. Well, that's quite a benchmark you're setting. So without further ado, please.
Well, I want to start off by thanking you all for having me here. It's a great honor to be speaking here in the EU Parliament. I'm going to be remembering that. I'll keep that distinction in mind. These distinctions matter because language matters, semantics matter, and this is going to bleed into the broader discussion we'll have today, in particular about wokeism, because they do infect the language as a basis point. So it is a very good point that you brought that up. I want to start off by saying why we fight and why is this so important. Well, wokeism is a disease. You need to look at it like a disease, and it is now being weaponized as a political tool and as a political weapon for the left, for the most radical elements of the left. And this is a disease, this is a weapon that is taking advantage of the nihilism that we are finding in the Western world, United States, Europe, wherever it may be, taking advantage of the lack of identity that many in the West are facing as we've erased God, we've erased the nation, we've erased the family as the foundation of our societies. It has left a vacuum that can become exploited by those that have ulterior motives at heart. And I'm speaking, of course, of the radical left, or more specifically, cultural Marxists. And I bring up cultural Marxism because this is really the driving force behind wokeism in the United States. The United States, for a long period of time, was very blessed not to have the same degree of, say, societal and class strife that plagued Europe for much of its history. This was due in part to just the great abundance of resources we had, the system of government we had for a long period of time, and these sort of Marxist, subversive left-wing movements never really took hold in the United States for much of our history. It wasn't until post-war, the 1960s and on, that it began to creep into our institutions, into our society, into the country at large. And what was their strategy? Well, their strategy was they simply couldn't take advantage of, a dichotomy of socioeconomic structures because it didn't simply exist. We had a very strong middle class. We had a very strong working class. So what did they devise? Well, they devised a twofold strategy. One is something you're all probably familiar with, the Fabian takeovers of the institutions, which we've seen play out the long march through the institutions. They've effectuated that plan with ease. But the second element is they needed to create divisions in society, divide and conquer. I know you guys were discussing all the different divisions among conservatives in the EU Parliament, and this is a struggle we face in the United States as well, divisions. But they created these divisions through this sort of woke identity politics that takes shape in the form of gender, in the form of race, whatever it may be. And it's becoming more extreme as time goes on, and it's designed to divide society along these arbitrary and created identities. They're not identities that you will have naturally. They're not positive identities. They're identities designed to cripple you, to demoralize you. And this is all part of a demoralization campaign. So you're no longer a man, now you're a woman, or you're some other gender, or you're no longer heterosexual, you're cisgender, or you're this type of, your sexual preference. And you can't just simply be white. You can't simply just be black. Everyone has to fight each other, and everyone has to be in constant conflict because this disunity and this sort of chaos, it allows these nefarious actors to really take control of the situation that we're finding ourselves in the United States. And I have to start off, frankly, for maybe apologizing because it seems that wokeism is the main export of the United States at the present. It is certainly an American creation. It was created on our university campuses. It was created in the great hotbeds of liberalism and leftism in the United States, and has been exported across the world through our power of media and arts and entertainment and pop culture and all the rest. And the United States is at the forefront of this war. And I know my good friend, member of the European Parliament, Harold Wilimski, said that Austria, we're considered a more conservative country and wokeism hasn't infected us. Well, I could say this, that wokeism moves very fast through society and moves very quickly. 10 years ago, we weren't even having these discussions. 20, 30 years ago, the discussions we're having today would seem preposterous to most people. It wouldn't even be along an ideological divide. You could have gone out in any chamber of a legislative body in Europe or the United States, and you could have talked about gender and identity and all these other concepts, and there would have been no dispute. But today, there are disputes. Today, it's violent rhetoric if you go against the established order, if you go against the standard line of thinking on these matters. And this shows how quickly things have shifted. Even 10 years ago, it wasn't this bad. Even under the Obama administration, it wasn't this bad. So it's only gotten progressively worse. And once it begins to infect society, it spreads at a ridiculous pace. And it spreads through the institutions that the left have taken over. And they've taken over most of the most important, if not all the institutions in the United States, whether it is higher education and academia, or the media, or pop culture, or whatever it is. And they're being able to spread it out, not only in our country, but abroad. And it creates a situation in society where we begin to really descend into a sort of Orwellian society. And if you dare to challenge it, if you dare to call it out, if you dare to identify it, you'll be canceled, you'll be doxxed, you'll be removed from your positions, you'll have your income taken away from you, and you'll be castigated to the outskirts of society. And this follows a clear strategic trend of the left. When they first create these problems, and this is really what they do. They create the issues, and then they create the victim group attached to those issues. So these problems don't exist, and these victim groups don't exist, but they create them, and then they create the hierarchy to support it. And then you get into this victim culture where everything you say or do has to be measured against these victim classes and all these different sort of postmodern dialectics that they've constructed. And you can't have an honest discussion. You can't have a normal discussion because you're so buried under the weight of this dense, woke nonsense that they're turning almost into a science. But the strategy that the left takes in the United States is when these topics first come up, and I'll give examples. At first they deny. They say this is not happening, you're crazy, you're a right-wing extremist. So for example, with the drag queen story hours, oh, this doesn't happen, this is not happening, this is such a joke by the right that you're trying to fearmonger. Okay, that's stage one. Then stage two comes and they say, oh, okay, it's happening, but it's in a few different things, but it's not a real problem. You're exaggerating. Okay? Then step three, they say, yes, it's happening in some places, but this is an important thing to do. This is respectable because it's part of a learning experience for the youth, but it's being done in a very controlled environment. Then they say, stage four, yes, these things are happening, but it's popular, it's organic, it's natural, and this is just the expression of the free will of society. And then stage five, which for someone like me in New York is where we are, and probably many of the cosmopolitan areas of Europe, stage five is, yes, it's happening, it's widespread, and you have to accept it. And if you don't accept it, then you're going to be, dehumanized, and you're going to be turned into any sort of vile caricature that they can create for you. And this is the strategy they follow with precision and with a certain methodology that you have to be impressed by, because the right can't replicate it for our issues. And the problem is once they reach stage five of this sort of woke progression, it's very hard to turn back. It's very hard to shift the Overton window back to where you started, because once they gain the ground, it becomes the situation that I think my colleague Mr. Volimsky was saying. He said once they've entrenched this position, now the new conservative position is to defend the present state of affairs and be against the alternative. So the new conservative position will begin to shift, and we'll become a mockery of ourselves. We'll be saying, well, we're fine with transgender drag queen story hours, but it has to be only for high schoolers, but not for elementary school. And that's the kind of mentality that they want to get you in. They want to get you in this defeatist mentality where you've already ceded most of the important ground to the left, and now you're arguing on their terms, on their frame, and on their narrative. You're not arguing that this form of wokeism is disgusting, it's sick, it's anti-God, it's anti-biology, it's anti-science. They want you to be arguing the different forms of wokeism, that we can just argue on the margins. And that's how they win. And at that point, we've won, and you've become nothing more than a controlled opposition of the left, and you're basically, playing their puppet games, and you're simply acting in the arena that they have created for you. And it's not simply a political issue or a cultural issue or a societal issue. We've been talking a lot about the transgender issue, which is just one component of it. But what we're seeing in the United States is the mutilation of the flesh and of the mind, that they are taking people, many of whom come from broken families, broken homes, and they are manipulating them, they're twisting them, and they're getting them to use these drugs that are irreversible. They're getting them to have these surgeries and procedures that are irreversible. And then you look at the studies, the quantitative studies, and it shows repeatedly that these individuals that undergo these procedures, that these individuals that undergo this drug treatment, they come out worse, they're depressive, they're suicidal, and they're violent. And we saw this recently. There was a brutal shooting in Nashville at a Christian school of a woman who ended up identifying as a man. She became transgender. And she grew up in a conservative household. She grew up in a Christian household in the South. And where did she go? She went to college. And maybe she was a little depressed. Maybe she wasn't happy. So what did they do? They effectively brainwashed her. They stripped her of her identity. They planted new ideas in her head, and she became a completely different person. And then she went from being, a quiet Christian girl from the South who liked to paint, and then she's walking around a school with an AR-15 shooting people down in cold blood. You don't go from these two things without a serious program of psychological terror, which is what wokeism is doing at the individual level, and it's doing it at the societal level. And it plays into things like feminism and gender and the racial groups and the racial tensions, because when they infect society, you have no longer a national consensus. You no longer have a national unity. So it becomes impossible to maneuver in any true and cohesive and effective political sense, because you're constantly on the defensive, you're constantly fighting among yourselves, and you can't look at an issue rationally. You can't look at an issue as boring as, say, where we're going to build a new train line, or what are we going to do about, utilities. These are very mundane topics, but everything becomes infected with this woke agenda. You can't even discuss subways in New York without discussing how it's going to impact, a Native American transgender person of color or something. It's insane, and it really turns society on its head. It's a waste of resources at a utilitarian level, but it's a destruction of the society as a whole on a fundamental level. And it's very easy to spread this sort of wokeism throughout the West. We haven't necessarily seen it infect other parts of the world that are not as, say, developed as we are, because what we've had in the West has been a destruction of religion, a destruction of society, traditional values, and all the rest. So wokeism is able to take over under these circumstances, but then you go to places like Africa or the Middle East or Europe or Asia, etc., and they reject it. And now we are seeing that it's no longer simply a ideology that's being pushed by the fringe academics of the left. We're seeing it's an ideology that is being pushed through the official functions of the United States government. The State Department, USAID, wherever it is, all these different embassies, they will go into different countries and they will say that the money that we are said to give to you for various projects, for humanitarian aid, or whatever it is, it's contingent on your country accepting some of these values that are frankly not even accepted in the United States. And it's sort of becoming the new national religion. It's becoming the new national ethos. If you go to Washington, D.C., the capital, you will find more transgender flags than you will find American flags. And it's a sick, sick thing. And it's meant to be visceral. It's meant to be in your face because they want to demoralize you. They want you to think that this is already fait accompli, and there's nothing more you can do, and you have to accept it and simply move on and accept your place in society as being part of this new woke culture that is dominating everything. And the political correctness, as mentioned, and the threats of being canceled and doxxed, these are all parts of their strategy. But they also target the youth first, and the youth are the most impressionable. And I discussed this at CPAC and some of the events we've had as well since then. The left has moved beyond persuasion politics, particularly in the United States. Maybe not in all of Europe, but certainly in the United States. We're post-political. Most of the country is post-political. You have two camps, and they're immovable. You have the conservative Republican camp, the Trump supporters, and you have the left dogmatic lunatics on one side. They're completely immovable. The part in the middle that could be persuaded by politics policy is vanishing day by day. And the left understands that, and the left created this situation. So what do? They do twofold. Obviously, mass migration is part of it, changing the electorate, but the second half of this is also the woke agenda, because if you can implement these policies institutionally at the schools, at state schools, at private schools, wherever, then you're indoctrinating an entire new generation who will eventually become voters, and they will be voting based on this ideology. And it does not matter what your family instills in you. It doesn't matter what background you come from. The institutions, from the moment you enter the schools until the moment you graduate, will be pumping you through with this type of ideology. And it's a sick, almost Maoist thing that they want to turn you against your family. They want to turn you against the values in which you were raised. And it's dividing households. It's dividing families. It's pitting people apart. And it's a really sick and twisted ideology. And they realize, why do we do these drag queen story hours? Why do we have such perverted material for children? Because you can start to really twist and shape a young mind at that age. It's extremely impressionable. It's fungible. It can be moved. These things are not going to change, someone like Harold Volinsky, for instance. He'll be repulsed by it. But you could certainly go after a younger child and move the needle that way. And that's exactly what they're doing. It's part of a very demented and cynical political strategy. And that's how we really have to view it. It's an extension of that. You cannot fight it properly without creating parallel institutions. So what I'm going to get into is that the fight against it, say in New York and say in the United States as a whole, and I'm not going to say that we're doing a fantastic job, but I think we've been fighting this fight for a little longer than Europe, and it's important to have this cross-pollination of ideas. It's fantastic to be with so many like-minded colleagues so we can learn from each other and express these situations that are happening in our relevant countries, because in the United States, people like to think that, this is just an American thing, and there aren't any conservatives in Europe, and there's certainly no conservatives in Europe that are talking about these topics, that are discussing them, and that are trying to fight them. But being able to show that, no, this is an issue in Austria and Germany and Hungary or wherever, that's important to show that this is an international fight, that we have allies and we're not isolated. But how do you fight it? You fight it in a similar way to how people fought communism under the Iron Curtain. You create parallel institutions, you create parallel structures, and we're seeing that. For example, with the schools, we're seeing the birth, the resurgence, the renaissance of a school choice movement, a movement that gives parents rights to fight back, to pick the schools that their children will go to pick the places that they will send their children to learn, to know the curriculum, to know what the teachers are teaching. And the silver lining to COVID with the lockdowns was that none of this really would have been possible, and it's been a massive political transformation in America, because the parents' rights movement really emerged after COVID, and it helped flip a lot of states red, including Virginia. It made a lot of states close. Even New York and New Jersey came within a few points because parents and suburban parents began to see the stuff that they were teaching their children when they were home, when they were at lockdowns. So it created this entire political upheaval, primarily against wokeism in the classroom, and it's leading to a resurgence of the school choice movement, which I think is one of the greatest successes in the fight against wokeism, allowing the parents to have rights, allowing the parents to choose the schools, to be involved, to criticize the teachers, to have these school boards and all these different elements. Obviously, this is probably very alien to most European countries who have very different systems of education, but in the United States, with the way it's structured, this has been a massive success for us. But also creating alternative media sources. Alternative media is growing. I mean, traditional mainstream media is collapsing, and I think wokeism, the left is pushing it too fast. They're overplaying their hand. And one part, I respect their strategy, because their strategy is very simple. When they have a temporary moment of power, they try to cram as much stuff through as possible, because they realize even if the right gets their act together, they maybe only get to repeal like 25%. So they push everything through, and then in a few years, they'll get back into office and they'll finish the job. In this case, I think the strategy may be backfiring, because it's so controversial, it's so beyond the pale, and it's turning away some of the traditional constituency groups of the left, including many working class Hispanic families, working class Black families, working class people in general that have been sometimes the bedrock of the Democrat Party and machine. And it really only plays to a certain cosmopolitan, upper income society. For example, in Manhattan, the most woke institutions are these exclusive private schools for the elites of society. And they target the elites first. They target the children of the elites because those are going to be the future decision makers. Those are going to be the people that give stamps of approval, stamps of credibility, and all the rest to this sort of dogma. And now it's beginning to percolate outside of the elite institutions, and it's starting to become part of, the regular public school and wherever, including in many red states. And the problem has been, one of the other problems in the United States to fighting this, which I'm sure you will be facing in Europe if you've not already, is the sort of fake right wing. The fake right wing that in the United States likes to make overtures to the free market, overtures to limited government, and say, oh, well, this is not an issue that we should be involving ourselves in. We believe in, the small market and no government involvement. But it's a very backwards and stupid way of viewing things because they constantly refuse to use power when they have it. And if you have a situation where one side uses power and the other doesn't, the side that uses it and leverages it is going to come out on top, which is exactly what they're doing. And they take advantage of these weak Republicans. They take advantage of these weak conservatives, and they allow them to be, burdened with this sort of dated view of governance that won't be able to fight back effectively against the left because they've mastered the art of moving these types of ideas, not just through the public sphere, but in the private sphere. And we've seen the corporate boardrooms have been taken over by wokeism before anything. And why is that? We saw Anheuser-Busch come out with this crazy transgender whatever freak drinking the Bud Light and promoting it, and they lost a massive amount of market share. And people ask, well, how could a company that caters primarily to Republican and conservative voters do such a thing? Well, corporate America and the private sector realized that they have nothing to worry about from a financial perspective as it comes to the right, because the right will fold. They'll say, we're not going to get involved. And the left, on the other hand, they'll boycott. The left will protest. The left will write a series of hit pieces. The left will attack you physically. So who does the boardroom fear? They fear the left. They don't fear the right, because the right has come out and said, we are not going to do anything. This is not an issue we're going to touch. We're not going to try to enforce anything. So the corporate boardroom makes a very calculated, profit-based decision. Okay, the conservative demographic in the United States is not going to do anything. The party apparatus is not going to do anything. So we'll push through with the leftist agenda. We'll get pats on the head, and they'll leave us alone. And they take it as an insurance policy. And that happens time and time again. The only time you see a little bit of pushback is when the industry that it's pertaining to happens to cater more to conservatives, whether it's beer or the NFL or something else. But outside of that, they've completely taken over most of corporate America. And you'll go to corporate America, and I've worked, in corporate America. I've worked at very left-wing media agencies on Madison Avenue in New York, and this was a few years ago. I remember, everyone in the office was forced, this is a corporate decision, on a certain day that the future is female. And it's like this feminist type of radical feminist ideology, and then they parade all the men and they take the photos, and then the next day they all come in with the transgender flags. They say everyone has to wear this. This is happening in corporate America, and this is the reason that we need to use government power to excise this problem from society, because if we're not going to wield government power to say that no, this is too far, you can't mutilate children, you can't pump drugs into their system, you can't promote divisive rhetoric, they're going to continue to do it, and that's what they've been doing with ease. But the fight back against it is what I've been seeing in places at the state level, say in Florida. I've been seeing in places like even Hungary, and I've been seeing it elsewhere, that they're beginning to understand that there is legislation, there is policy that can be promoted to push this stuff out of society, to stigmatize it, and to make sure that we identify exactly what it is, where it is, and make sure that it is ridiculed, it is criticized, and eventually it's made illegal. And unless we do that, it's going to continue to infect society until it ultimately, which is the goal, deconstructs society. It's a deconstruction of the left because they want to rebuild society in their image. And that's really ultimately what it comes down to. It's not the only vehicle of the left, but it is certainly one of the most visceral. You have to deny the reality in front of you, that I'm not looking at a woman, I'm not looking at a man, I'm looking at something else entirely. And this is where we're at. This is where we're at as a society. But as I was mentioning earlier, the pushback. They overplayed their hand, and we've seen a lot of disgust, we've seen a lot of reaction to it, and it is bringing people to our side. And the response to it is to build the parallel institutions, build organizations, build a social fabric, build a social network like we've done with some of the young Republican clubs. We're the largest in the country in a deep blue area, and this is being replicated across the country. We took over Washington, D.C., we took over ones in Texas and other places, and we're pushing a reaction to this rather than just a laissez-faire attitude that doesn't want to touch it. So you build the social parallel structures through conservative media, through conservative schools, through all these institutions, and then when and where you have power, you have to wield it, and you have to understand that this is a crisis that cannot be solved by putting your hands back. It has to be solved via direct government action where applicable, especially as it pertains to state schools, to the curriculum, to the institutions of government. What's happening at the State Department, what's happening at USAID needs to end on day one. And this can be done. This can be done if we have President Trump back in office, and I do believe he'll be back in office very soon, particularly with the polls that have been coming out, both in the primary and in the general election. He never polled this well in 2020, and he never polled this well in 2016, which is something to keep in mind as you see polls that show him up by 7 points, by 8 points, by close to 10 points over Biden. That would be an electoral landslide that we haven't seen in many, many years. And I do believe that the Republican Party is moving in the right direction. The institutions are being created. The think tanks are being created. They're moving things. They're moving the needle. And once we get back to Republican control at the federal level, we can begin to implement these policies, but it's already happening at the state level to much success. So I wish I had better news. It's not all good news, but certainly being able to identify the problem and fight it is the first step. And again, I want to thank you all again for having me here, giving me the honor to speak to many distinguished guests and colleagues, and I'm looking forward to building these cooperations in the future. I think this is very needed. We can't have a Republican Party that's parochial or very close-minded and small-minded. We need to be able to learn, not just from history, but we have to be able to learn from the present, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in different countries, because there are successes to be had in Europe, there are failures to be had in Europe, there are successes in the United States, and there are failures in the United States, and the left is at their best and their most effective and their most potent when we are in boxed little isolated cubicles and we don't understand what's happening. The international left have been very effective because they've built a network that crosses state borders where they're able to implement ideas with ease, and that's why we've seen generations of leftists slowly taking over the institutions of power in the West. They learn that. These are ideologically neutral tactics that we can implement as right-wingers, as conservatives, as whatever. And I'm looking forward to building these ties across the Atlantic moving forward. So thank you very much.